yourself as a presuppositionalist, you're not saying that at some point in your argument before the conclusion you assert God's existence, correct? That's not what you're saying.
So I wrote it out formally as a formal argument form.
Perfect.
Yeah. You want to see it? Let me. If I try to do it off the top of my head, I'll probably say one of the premises is wrong.
Yeah,
Let me see, in the meantime, I would just like to note that what I'm saying is that you could still charge me with, you could still say that my argument is fallacious, but you can't say that it's circularity is fallacious.
Well, I'm not convinced of that. That's why I'm waiting for the form.
Mm. Here you go. Do you see the link in the chat?
Yeah.
You'd be actually doing me a favor if you could point out how that commits the question begging fallacy in some way.
I mean, premise 2 is weird, right? If God does not exist, then there's no intelligible experience, since God is the precondition of intelligibility, right? Presumably, well, in premise 3, you say there is intelligible experience, right? So in 2 premises, you've established there's intelligible experience and that God is the precondition of all intelligible experience. And that's before the conclusion of your argument. I take that to be you asserting God's existence before the conclusion, right? That's even before the modus tollens on, right? So I mean, I was correct to accuse you of being a presuppositionalist in that sense. It doesn't matter if the first premise is the Christian God does not exist, right? Again, in premise 2 and premise 3, you established that despite what you said in premise 1, God still exists.
Let me ask you this. Do you think all transcendental arguments are question-begging fallacies, or just the ones that Christians use? I mean,
I've had no experience of tags that don't assert God's existence.
Not even tags, just transcendental arguments in general. Do you think that they are all necessarily question-begging, or just the ones that Christians use?
Well, I mean, I don't have the necessary experience to answer that question definitively. Okay, I'd say in my experience, all the tags I've confronted do beg the question.
But not even tags, like just normal transcendental arguments. In other words, there are philosophers out there who reject.
Yeah, the answer is
there are philosophers out there who reject the idea of transcendental arguments altogether. Like they say that they can't ever be successful for a number of different reasons. So I was going to see if that was your position, then that would be the issue we would have to get into before.
Do you acknowledge that the argument begs the?
No, I don't think it does. I don't think it does. I mean, what do you? Let's see. Where is this?
Can you explain how from premise 2 to premise 3 you're not asserting the?
Let's see. God did not exist. Well, keep in mind that the argument that we are allowed to have premises. I mean, that's how you argue, right?
I don't understand how that. Obviously.
So God is the way this argument form is set up. It's positive to begin with. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. I will go back and think about it.
Well, look. So let me try to explain this again.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. I take question begging to just mean the conclusion is snuck into a premise. I take premise 2 and premise 3 to be saying that because there's intelligible experience, God has to exist. Right. So I take that to be an assertion of the existence of God. And given that that's being snuck into a premise of your argument prior to the conclusion, and it's not just the assertion of some like antecedent in a conditional thing like that, I understand the argument to be begging the question. Now, if you have a reason to think that that's not the case, I'd be in. And since you were earlier in our conversation in text chat, you said it is indeed the case that question begging is a fallacy, right? My initial criticism would stand, right? If you're not holding to the, just real quick, I'm almost done. If you're not holding to the existence of the Christian God, it's not a persuasive argument.
Well, persuasion and fallacies are two different things, right? And you're saying that it's fallacious, and I don't see how it's fallacious. I mean, what I'll do is I'll just look at it to make sure. But
all right, then let's approach this. Let's approach this in pieces. Then you agree that begging the question is a fallacy, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
You understand begging the question to be sneaking the conclusion into a premise of an argument.
Okay.
Right. Now, if it can be established that the argument as a premise asserts the existence of the Christian God before the conclusion, right, we would understand that to be.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you accept the reason?
By the way, that's so in deductive inferences, when you do that, the deductive conclusion of the inference doesn't follow because the premise is already including the conclusion, right? Would you agree with that?
Sorry.
So let's say in a typical deductive inference, premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, right? If the conclusion is utilized as one of the premises, that's that's an example of the question begging fallacy, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
that's different from a conditional or something similar to a conditional, right? It's not question. I mean, there are philosophers who think that all deductive arguments beg the question, right? But that's not really. We don't need to go into that. What I'm saying is, it's different if you say, if X then Y, X therefore Y, because if X then Y is presented as a condition.
Which one of the premises in this argument did you say was the actually committing the fallacy?
Well, I take premise 3 to establish that God.
That's terrible, right? Yeah.
That's not the point of his criticism.
What do you mean?
It's terrible. I'll tell you what. I'll look at it.
What do you think? I don't even.
He's turning. It's an emotional argument, though.
I don't know if I'm having an aneurysm or something. Like I'm just saying, if that's the case, right? If you're saying God exists as a premise, if we can establish that, and then the conclusion is God exists.
So would you say that? What about the assumption at the starting of the argument that we're assuming God exists?
I'm phasing in and out of existence here. Yeah, if you assume God's existence as a premise and the argument would conclude with God's existence, that would also be begging the question. Wow. Yeah, and that's typically the route that most presuppositionalist arguments take. This is structured slightly differently, but what I'm trying to tell you is that after premise 2, following with premise 3, you're already establishing God's existence, right? You don't need to proceed any further to gather that from the argument. And if that's the case, given that premise 5, which is really the conclusion, is just the assertion of God's existence, yeah, I take that to be begging the question, which would mean my initial criticism that it would be unpersuasive to somebody who didn't hold to the existence of God.
Well, again,
Pogan, sorry, real quick, Pogan, would the antinomy of that also be question begging? Wouldn't it?
Okay, he's saying that are you saying that if the premise started that God did not exist and then the argument proceeded roughly the same way that you're asking?
It doesn't matter. So it could be premise 1 or it could be premise 19, right? If the conclusion is God exists and there's a premise that asserts God exists or implies God exists, or the argument can be rewritten to establish that a premise asserts the existence of God, right? And then just in layman's terms, the spirit of the argument is maintained. All of these, in my view, unless you have some sort of disagreement, would constitute question begging.
It just seems
because I just think question begging to be
because the entire argument
the conclusion is snuck into a premise.
the argument is sort of a toy situation that starts with God's existence. So I mean, to say that it's question begging is like it's just I don't know. I don't know how exactly to. I'll tell you what. I'll look it over and think about it and try to come up with a more precise way to analyze what you're saying.
Well, what Pogan is saying is, if you come up with an argument where the conclusion is God exists, but you haven't used that as a way to build the fact that God exists, you'll have a compelling argument.
No, I know. I understand the question begging fallacy. I just don't understand how this is an example of it.
So, Pogan, isn't the conditional a necessary premise in order to determine that if that condition is met, then therefore we can conclude that God exists? It is a necessary, conditional there. I mean, you're saying there is no fucking conditional to be made prior to the conclusion that God
exists. Most philosophers don't take conditionals to be the same thing as a premise that would result in question begging. Right? Most philosophers don't understand modus ponens to be begging the question because it's phrased as a conditional, not just an assertion.
Well, this would be a modus tollens, actually, I think.
I understand. I'm giving an example to him of something that's a conditional, right? Resulting in the affirmation of the consequent that isn't question begging.
I'm going to go off mic, but I will consider this, and if it looks like it's question begging, I'll just give it up. I mean,
yeah, I'm pretty active.
How is that not clear already?
Hold on. If you have,
it should be.
Well, it should be, but
if you have a response, just real quick, if you have a response at any point, just tag me or DM me. I'll get on voice as soon as I can.
I don't even know who's talking.
Where is he begging the question? Like, be clear, not just say, "Hey, if you beg the question, that's a fallacy." So you beg the question, therefore it's a fallacy. Just